for her pioneering work, both with the foundation and with the government and policy. But the most honored guests are you, because nothing we do leads to change unless you work on the front lines, making these changes possible. My colleagues from England and the U.S. are much more expert than I am in many of the areas that we're going to talk about in the next few days, as well as today. So I will just try to give an overview and introduce you to why the current model that we're using of violence is not working as well as we would like, and what model we can substitute for that, the model of coercive control that we believe would protect women much more completely and support not only their safety, but also their freedom and their equality, which is why, after all, we do the work that we do. When we talk about violence or stalking or sexual coercion or any of the other assaults on women today and tomorrow and the next day, ask yourself how we would respond if these same things were being done to men in our community. If thousands and tens of thousands of our brothers and fathers and co-workers were being assaulted and sexually coerced and followed and intimidated and isolated and controlled, how would we respond? And then ask, why have we not responded in the same way when these things happen to our mothers and our sisters and our wives and our classmates who are women? I want you in the next couple of days, but starting now, to bring into the room someone you know, maybe yourself, or someone you have worked with, or a neighbor who has experienced abuse. Because I think what we will say will be much more meaningful if you have a face like the face by Matisse that I put in front of you. And so I would like to present a story of one of the women that I work with. This woman is named Dila Barisha, and she was born in Albania, but came to the U.S. And I began to work with her because one evening she took a gun that her husband kept underneath his pillow, and she shot him 4 times directly and killed him. Then she went downstairs and she telephoned the police. And then, after telephoning the police, she returned upstairs to their bedroom to get the gun because she was afraid he might come after her. When the police came and arrested her, they took her down to the station and they asked her various questions while she was in the police car. And I just want to read to you what one of the police officers wrote and think about why she's talking about what she's talking about. Does she say that the violence was terrible? Listen to what she does say. This is the police officer writing. Mrs. Bayless, I have to use a different name, Mrs. Bayless described her husband as a very complex person. She said he always demanded an exact outline of how she spent her day. She said she would have to prepare a summary of meals planned for the month for his approval. She said he was never happy with macaroni. That's something we eat more of. He was never happy with macaroni or steak or potatoes, but instead demanded meals of veal marsala, favorite Albanian dish. Even when the menus were planned, she could never please him. She never did anything good enough for his demands. She relayed one instance which prompted a beating, explaining that they had bought their house about 1 year ago. He asked her to tell him what they needed for the house. She said she began to name various things they needed for the house, and the police officer says nothing in particular was named. And he asked her, did she think shades were important for the windows? She said, yes, they were also something they needed. He then demanded to know why she hadn't thought of shades herself, and that she wasn't caring enough. And then he began to beat her. Now, the police were very, very surprised and confused by why a woman who would kill her husband the way she did would talk about menus and veal marsala instead of talking about how horrible the violence was. And we'll come back to this case as we go along, and hopefully we'll have time, and try to answer this simple question. Because I think that if you can understand why a woman like Dila Barisha would kill her husband over something seemingly as trivial as the menu, you can have a new understanding of the indignity and control and lack of liberty that so many of the women and children in our communities are suffering. Now, what I'm going to try to do briefly this morning is explain why the violence model isn't working, why we have to look beyond violence, and then offer a way, another model, the model of coercive control, that hopefully will help you do this. The first thing I want to remind you of is that the revolution that we have made, probably many of you, as well as some of us who are a little older, over the last 40 years, the domestic violence revolution is as radical a change as any change the world has witnessed in the last 50 years. I believe it is as radical as the elimination of apartheid in South Africa. I believe it is as radical as the transformation of the former Soviet Union. I believe it is as radical as the civil rights movement in our own United States, because it has improved and protected millions of women around the world. When we started the first shelter, when we started hiding women in our house at home in the United States in 1974, there were no shelters for women. Last year in the United States alone, we sheltered almost 4 million women and children. When we began, no men were being arrested for domestic violence. Last year in the United States alone, we arrested almost 1.5 million men and 250,000 women for violence in their families. And I could go on about the legal changes and the cultural changes and the changes in child welfare. Many of them also have happened in Taiwan, many of them as a result of the wonderful work the Modern Women's Foundation and others have done here, no question about it. But I also want to say to you that despite our tremendous achievements, I'm trying to make this work. Yeah, I think I can do this right. Despite our tremendous achievements, the domestic violence revolution that we have started has stalled. And I just use some examples. one of the great achievements, and please beg my forgiveness, I beg your forgiveness, for using examples from England and the UK and from the United States. This is where my understanding is, my research. One of the great achievements we have made in the United States because of our strong laws against domestic violence is that we have greatly reduced homicide by partners in this time. Homicide by partners in the U.S. has gone down almost 60% since we opened the first shelters and made it mandatory for police to make arrests in domestic violence cases. And actually, the incidence of the most severe forms of partner violence that cause injury have dropped 40% since we began our work in the mid-1970s. These are tremendous achievements and have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. But I want you to look at this table because what it shows is, do we have this not working? The thing is not working? Okay. Thank you. What I want you to see from this table is that even though we have reduced homicides by partners dramatically, as you can see, the killing of men by women who are abused has dropped much more than the killing of women. Since we started protecting women and removing them for shelters and providing protection orders, homicides of men by these same women has dropped 60% overall, and for the highest risk groups in the United States, people of color, it has dropped almost 80%, which is a greater drop in a health problem than almost any other problem we can imagine. Whereas the killing of women has changed almost not at all in this same period. In fact, for Caucasian women in the United States, there has been no substantial change in the risk of being killed by an abusive partner. Now, why is this? Well, one reason is because when men kill women, they do it because the woman is threatening to separate and leave them, and they feel they may lose their control, or she has separated. When women kill men, it tends to be in situations, not necessarily self-defense, when they feel themselves or their children are being threatened. By providing protection orders, by providing shelter, by providing arrest, we have provided temporary safety and removed the women so that they don't have to respond violently the way Dealer did and kill or try to protect themselves with violence against the men. But because we have not prevented those same men from continuing to have access to those women, and because the protections we provide are very short-term, so that the women are back in the situation where the men can get at them and probably very angry because they've been arrested or otherwise sanctioned, we have actually not protected them in the long run and instead offered protection against men. Nothing wrong with protecting us men, but you can see that it raises some questions about the need for more effective strategies. This is some information from England by my colleague at the University of Bristol, Marianne Hester. And what she shows is that for every 100 cases in which domestic violence is reported to the police in England, only 3.6 result in any kind of punishment. Can you see that? Only 3.6% result in any kind of punishment. That means that there's an attrition rate, what we call attrition, from a complaint of domestic violence to the police to the actual punishment of 3.6%. If I were a woman in England, I could make the argument that despite the fact that we have many laws that are used to prosecute men who commit domestic violence, we have not made domestic violence a crime. When a person who is committing a crime or about to commit a crime knows that they only have 3 chances in 100 of being punished, that is not going to inhibit the crime in any sense at all. And another fact about England is that, and from this research, is that men who commit multiple offenses, 50 or 60 or more offenses, are not punished any more severely than men who commit one offense. That there is no difference in the punishment on the 50th offense than there is on the first. In the case of Dila Berisha, I was able to document that she had been assaulted by her husband 300 times. 300 times. And yet he had never been arrested. She had never, except on one occasion, gone to a doctor or called the police. She had so much bruises on her hands that she could not take off her wedding rings from her fingers because she had been covering her head. You can excuse me. She had been covering her head, and he would beat her on the head, and so her fingers had become so swollen. But not once were the police involved. Not once did she go to a doctor, except on one occasion when he slammed her hand into a car door and broke her finger. Okay. I can say yay, yay, or yay, yay, thanks. So the point I want to make is that something is very wrong when we have a strong law. We're arresting many hundreds of thousands of men in England and over 1 million men a year in the United States, and yet none of these men, or only a tiny proportion of these offenders, are being sanctioned. So why is this happening? I believe it's happening because the model that we're using to understand partner abuse is wrong. It doesn't correspond to what the women and children in our communities are experiencing. This model is based on a number of things. The first assumption is that partner abuse is primarily about violence. The first woman who brought her 9-year-old daughter and hid at my house in Connecticut in the United States told me violence wasn't the worst part. But we didn't know at the time what that meant. It has taken us almost 40 years to understand what this woman was saying. And instead, when she would say violence wasn't the worst part, we would turn to her and say, talk about the violence. Because we knew how hard it was for women to talk about the violence. Now we understand how hard it is for women to talk about the other aspects of abuse. But our model assumes that this is about violence. And how does it determine how serious abuse is? Well, the obvious way is by the level of violence. Cases which involve injury are assumed to be much more serious than cases that don't. Remember, I told you that in the United States, injurious violence by partners has dropped 40%. This is a tremendous achievement. But in the same period, non-serious violence, the violence that corresponds to the 300 assaults that were experienced by Dila Berisha, non-serious violence, pushing or shoving or punching or hair pulling, nothing any of us would want to happen to us, but not something that is going to impress a social worker or a police officer or a physician in the hospital. Non-serious violence has increased so dramatically, while serious violence was declining, that the overall levels of violence that women in the United States and the UK are experiencing today is exactly the same as it was when we opened our house to women and children 40 years ago. Now, you can take the position that non-serious violence, pushing and shoving, is not as bad as violence that causes injury, so we should be happy with that fact. But I will try to convince you that the most devastating form of abuse, coercive control, is actually closely related to the frequency of minor violence, not to the kind that causes black eyes and broken arms, the kind that Dila Berisha was experiencing every week of her marriage. Now, it did cause problems, but again, not dramatic, not something that a police officer who's dealing with robberies or street assaults, or a doctor who is dealing with knife wounds in a hospital is going to be impressed by. And we also assume not only that violence and injury are important, but that most of this abuse is occurring in intact, intimate relationships. And I'm going to show you that this is not true, that not only is domestic violence not about violence, but it is also primarily not domestic. And finally, we direct our interventions at the offenders and the victims, but we forget to direct our interventions at the larger community systems and structures that impose inequality and perpetuate inequality, which, as you'll see, support the violence. Let me quickly show you why the violence model is not working and why it's wrong. First thing I want you to see is that violence is a problem throughout women's lifetime. And this just shows you, this is just designed to show you, I don't know if I have, yes. This is just designed to show you several things. First, that domestic violence is a tremendous problem among young women 16 to 18. When England added coercive control to its definition of domestic violence last year, it also extended protections to young women 16 to 18. And what you see from this research here is that 38% of the injuries to girls 16 to 18 are the result of partner violence. Again, these couples aren't living together. 38% of the injuries to young women. Why it's so important to have a campaign that includes, and many of these young women are not really the shelters we offer and the services we offer are often not appropriate for these young women. And at the other end of the spectrum are women my age. That is, women who are over 60 or over 65, and we find that 18% of the injuries to women that age are also domestic violence injuries. I'm not now talking about elder abuse, where the victim is frail and elderly. I'm talking about older women who have been abused for many, many years. And again, ask ourselves, are the services that we offer really appropriate for this population? So these are two groups which right now fall between the cracks. Quickly, is domestic violence, remember I told you that the violence model treats domestic violence as a discrete incident or an assault. We respond, remember we saw from England that even if someone commits 50 assaults, it's still treated as if it was the first assault, because the police and the law treat each incident of domestic violence as a distinct and separate event, right? And many of our services are predicated, including protection orders, on the idea that there's going to be a big time between these assaults when the victim can get out with our help and the offender can think about his behavior. What this shows you, and I'm not going to read it because you have it in your book and you can see it, is that partner violence is almost never a discrete incident. It is always repeated, and it is almost always a course of violent conduct. So treating it as a distinct incident is probably incorrect. Secondly, domestic violence, the vast majority of domestic violence is not serious, is relatively trivial. Now, what do I mean by that? Large numbers of women are killed by domestic violence. In our surveys in England and the United States, hundreds of thousands of women have been stabbed and choked and permanently disfigured and harmed in a variety of other ways. But 95 to 99% of all partner abuse, physical abuse, does not cause injury and is relatively minor. And I'm showing that in this table by looking at 3 places, the emergency room, the military, and the police, where you would expect to see the most serious cases, and what you find is that the vast majority of these cases are not causing injury. Now, that doesn't mean they're not bad, that we wouldn't want that to happen to us, remember. So when I say that these assaults are trivial or not serious, do I mean that the domestic violence is trivial or not serious? Exactly not. You have already seen that it's almost always repeated and typically frequent. Now you see that what is frequent is the low-level violence, the pushing and the shoving and the holding and the grabbing and the punching. And ask yourself what it would be like to live with someone, or to have a neighbor, or to have someone in your family who punched you and kicked you and held you and grabbed you day after day, year after year. What would the cumulative effect be? And then now ask yourself, if I'm a police officer and I'm forced to look only at the particular incident, or if I'm a physician and I'm only looking at the particular incident, or a social worker and only looking at the particular incident, and 95 to 99% of these incidents are trivial, who is going to go to jail? No one is going to go to jail, right? Who is going to be considered seriously at risk? None of these cases. Can you see what I'm saying? So when you look at domestic abuse through the window of violent and serious violence only, you miss 95 to 99% of all of the cases in your community. And what is more, as you will see, these are the most serious cases that you'll find. Now, the other thing to understand is that this frequent assault is going on for an average of 5.5 to 7.2 years. That's based on my research and the research of others in the United States. And if you now add together the frequency with the length of time which abuse is going on average, and many relationships go on many, many years more than this, you can understand why it is not so unusual for a woman like Dila Berisha to have suffered 300 assaults. Now remember, you're a social worker. You're not just dealing now with one case of violence in a family. You're now maybe dealing with 200 or 300. This is by no means unusual. Or a police officer dealing with 200 or 300. And you can now see that it is the cumulative effect of being subjected to this over time that has the tremendous impact. The next thing I want you to see is that this has tremendous health consequences. I don't have time to go into all of this. This is some of my own research and Dr. Flitcraft's research that we talked about at Yale. But what we find is that women who are abused are much more likely to suffer from alcohol problems, 15 times more likely. 9 times more likely to suffer drug problems, many times more likely to suffer from HIV, AIDS, or homelessness, or suicide attempts, or child abuse in their families. So one question is, are these women who have many, many problems, and therefore, as a result of these problems, they get together with men who are going to hurt them? They make bad choices in lovers, unlike the rest of us who have only made good choices in partners. And the answer is that before the onset of domestic violence, women who are abused are no more likely to experience more alcohol, more drug abuse, more suicide attempts, more depression, more child abuse, more homelessness, more HIV/AIDS than women who are not abused. Do you understand? In other words, it is only in the context of being abused that women begin to develop alcohol and drug problems disproportionately. In other words, I'm not saying that none of these women drink to excess or take drugs to excess or are depressed before the abuse. I'm just saying they are no more likely to have these problems before the onset of abuse. And they only begin to self-medicate with the alcohol or the drugs or attempt suicide in the context of ongoing abuse, and I might add, in the context of the failure on our part to effectively intervene to prevent the ongoing abuse. Now, of course, these problems, once they develop, greatly increase a woman's susceptibility to violence. But it also means that if you're going to treat the alcohol and you don't treat the violence, or the drug abuse and you don't treat the violence, or the homelessness, or the AIDS, or the depression, and you don't treat the violence, that you will not effectively relieve these other problems. It also means that if you work in a place which deals with alcohol or drugs or homelessness or HIV/AIDS or mental health, that every woman who comes to you, you must open the window that she provides by coming to you and see through that window the entire history of abuse that she presents. So, now I've mentioned that these women are much more likely to have these problems. I don't want to give you the idea that most battered women have these problems. Most do not. Most do not. But enough do, and this is remarkable, enough do so that domestic violence, in my research and the research of many others, has been shown to be the leading cause of women's suicide attempts, of female alcoholism, of child abuse. 45% of all of the children in our hospital, and there is lots of evidence from child protection services around the world that shows this to be true, 45% of all of the mothers of children who are abused in our hospital have themselves been abused. And one study at Harvard showed it was 50%. And anywhere from 30 to 70% of the child welfare caseloads include domestic violence. So what this means is that domestic violence is far and away, there's nothing that even comes close, far and away the leading context for a whole range of women and children's health problems. And then ask yourself, are the resources we are committing in those arenas to deal with domestic violence equivalent to the significance of the problem that's there? But now let me then just summarize what I've been saying and offer you this, that domestic violence is not about episodes of assault. It's about a continuous process of assault and abuse. When you ask women, what is domestic violence? They will tell you that it's ongoing and continuous. And what's interesting is that even women who have never been physically assaulted will describe abuse as continuous and ongoing. Secondly, We should not be talking about offenders in the criminal justice language of recidivists, meaning somebody who does it once and then does it again and then does it again. They are much more closely identified with what in police language we would call career criminals, but much more accurately described as conducting a course of criminal conduct rather than individual events, each one of which involves a decision-making process which can be interrupted at that point. Rather, you're talking about an ongoing pattern of behavior. And again, it is not injury itself which creates the highest risk, but it's the frequency and duration of violence, and as you'll see in a little bit, the level of control in the relationship that actually describes the risk. And I'll describe that to you and explain why that is so. I didn't give you the figures, but I just will mention them now. More than half of the men we are arresting in the United States for domestic violence are not living with the women that they are accused of assaulting. And what we are talking about then is something that in sociology lingo crosses social space, which limits the effectiveness of protection orders and many of the strategies that we have unless, and we'll hear more about that later, we address stalking and we address domestic violence with the same legislation and the same services. And when we apply the domestic violence model, no one goes to jail. No one goes to jail because the vast majority of assaults are trivial, and when we judge them on an incident basis, they appear trivial and no one is punished. This is not the failure of the police. This is the failure to give police and our community the adequate tools and understanding that they need to respond effectively. Not only that, historical abuse is never identified because it remains below the radar. If we wait in the hospital for injury, we miss, remember, 95 to 90% of the abuse. If we think that's not real abuse because it only involved a push, and don't open the window and learn that that push and shove has been going on hundreds of times for 5 to 7 years, we miss the cumulative and devastating effect that it can have on women like Dila Barisha. And if we develop high-risk models which rely on injury and severe violence, we're going to miss 95 to 90%, 99% of the severe cases. And more importantly, how do we respond? Those of us in social work and those of us in policing know that when someone comes back to us again and again, if I'm a judge or a police officer, no matter how sympathetic I am, after someone comes back to me again and again, it's very hard for me not to start to judge them, to not to say that something is wrong with her. Yes, we may feel badly about what's happening, but we also think maybe it's just tragic and possibly inevitable that this kind of woman or this kind of man is going to engage in that behavior. In other words, as abuse escalates, we withdraw from the family. Exactly as coercion and control become most devastating and threatening, our social work, our police, our health providers, even the most sympathetic ones, begin to talk about that family. I don't know what the parallel expression is in Taiwan, but you know what I'm talking about. Every social worker service has a name for somebody they see again and again. And instead of police recognizing, or social workers recognizing, or hospitals recognizing that when somebody comes back to us again and again, it means we've done something right, that they trust us to use us again, we pull away from them so that at the very moment when they need us most, we're least available. And importantly, it means that victims themselves begin to minimize their own experience Because we don't take it seriously, they think they're not abused. I've had many women call me and say, "Doctor, I'm not one of those abused women." And then tell me a 5-10-year history of this pushing and shoving and having someone take their money and sexual coercion. But because she doesn't look like the woman on the poster with the black eye or the woman in the movie who's been beaten down, she feels, "I'm not one of those abused people." And then we wonder, why don't more women report and come forward and tell us what's going on? And part of what makes this so tragic is that, now I have to make sure I'm on the same. Part of what makes this, does this say abuse is preventable? Anybody know? I don't think so. That's better. So part of the tragedy of this is that our research shows that we can prevent abuse. Most abuse we see in the community, and this shows you out of every 100 cases of women who report abuse, the vast majority, almost 86% of them, are ongoing cases. What does that mean? It means that if we were to deal with ongoing cases with effective early intervention, we could reduce abuse to 14 to 21 cases out of every 100 we see now. In other words, we could make it a manageable problem and not feel overwhelmed by it. So the biggest tragedy about our response is that abuse is preventable. If we deal with it as an ongoing problem, the number of new cases, relatively low in our community, can be dealt with. In that sense, it's much like AIDS or HIV. There are very few new cases of AIDS, right? But because we haven't found an effective treatment for AIDS, the prevalence of AIDS, as a term we use in public health, the burden it places on our community is enormous, right? But if we were to find an effective treatment and just reduce it to the number of new cases, we could deal with it relatively easily and inexpensively. So now let me talk about the alternative. Because if the violence model isn't working, we do have a model that is working. And I won't have time to go into this at length. Other speakers will address it, and we will talk about it tomorrow and in our workshops. But I do want to at least begin a conversation with you. One way of looking at partner abuse, and notice I use the term partner abuse, not domestic violence, which is the term used in the UK, because we're not just talking about violence. And I want to get away from that idea, is to divide it into 3 different categories. I'm not going to talk about 2 of them, but I just want to mention them. The first category is fights. And social workers and police will know what I'm talking about. We're constantly finding situations in which couples use violence with each other. It may be against the law. Somebody may get hurt. It's not good for children to live in situations where there's fighting. But the partners are relatively equal. There's not a pattern of victimization over time. And these are usually not the cases for which women seek our help. Secondly, we're dealing with what you might call domestic violence or partner assault. Cases in which there's violence, there's emotional abuse, and violence may be repeated, but the woman continues to work, she continues to care for her children, she continues to go about her business because she has control of her money, she's not being followed and stalked, so she has freedom of movement. The main problem here is the physical violence, and we have now, and I have to say this to you, and some of my colleagues may be critical of me for saying this, over 100 studies which show that women use violence as much as men do in family conflict situations. Women hit men as much as men hit women. They don't do it as frequently, and you'll see some evidence. They don't do it with as harsh consequences. They don't do it in ways that produce fear in men in the same ways that men produce fear in women. But the idea that women are not violent and that only men are violent is not an idea which helps us understand partner abuse. Because, as I'm telling you, partner abuse and the police response and the state response and the social work response is not about whether people use violence, as much as we may be opposed. When my daughter, who's now my son, because he had a surgery and is transgendered, family challenge, but when my daughter was in high school, if he didn't fight, it's complicated, the pronouns, translator, forgive me. When she was in high school, if she didn't fight, if another girl called her a name or insulted her, she would have to eat her lunch in the bathroom. And she was a tiny little thing. She's now a tiny little boy, but she was a tiny little girl, a woman. I shouldn't say tiny, she's as tall as I am, but you know. In other words, for her, fighting was part of retaining her dignity. And even if it ended up that she was hurt much more seriously than the other person, the kind of insults, the kind of bullying that was taking place often came to an end. Now, I'm not suggesting violence as a solution to a problem, and many of you may oppose violence in any form. But what I am suggesting to you is that fighting and violence are not why we started to address partner abuse and domestic violence. We started to address a peculiar kind of violence which was taking place in the context of inequality, and because it took place in the context of inequality, it has a set of effects on our community and on women and on children that are completely different than the effects of fights and violence. I mean, we may continue to arrest people who commit assaults, whether they're women or men. But when we're dealing with the devastating pattern of coercive control that we see in 60 to 80% of the clients who come to us, the women and children who come to us for help, we're dealing with a completely different phenomenon. We're dealing not with domestic violence in the weak sense, where there's fighting or hitting. We're dealing with domestic violence in the strong sense, where the use of abuse is enforcing inequality and restoring a man's privilege by denying women the dignity and autonomy that is the right of every person on our society. So coercive control is different than partner assault and fighting, and we now know it characterizes the majority of women who are coming to us for help. First, let me just be clear, and I've summarized this, that partner assault is essentially what we now think of as domestic violence and characterizes some proportion, but a small proportion, probably around 20%, possibly as many as 40% of the cases we're likely to see. And it also is still a very common form of domestic violence in communities where when women go in public and they're wearing the wrong clothes, their mother-in-laws or their neighbors will restrict them, where women are not allowed to work. And therefore, men can use violence much more effectively to control women, because if they do anything else, they're going to be controlled by the community. They're going to be controlled by their family. They're going to be controlled by their religious community, right? I don't have to tell my wife that she has to dress a certain way if, when she doesn't dress that way, other people in the community are going to censure her for doing that. So it's only in countries like Taiwan, only in countries like the United States and in England and in Germany and in France and in Bulgaria and much of the world, where women have 50% in the workforce and women have established a range of rights. Not that there still is an inequality, but that they've moved up to inequality. I have a chapter in my book called Up to Inequality. In other words, being unequal is better than being subordinate. It's not good, but it's at least a little better. So what we're dealing with in coercive control is something different. Now, I have a definition of coercive control. I'm not going to read it to you. It's a clumsy term. But all you need to know is that it involves a pattern of behavior that, at a minimum, includes these various elements of violence, intimidation, isolation, and control. And throughout all of these elements is the pattern of degradation and humiliation, which denies women the dignity to which they're entitled. Again, understand what I'm saying, that if you don't start with the assumption that women have an entitlement to full equality, you can't understand any of this. Forcing a woman like Dila Berisha to account for every minute of her time would not be considered disrespectful or controlling unless you assume that every woman, including Dila Berisha, has a right to determine how she spends her time. Forcing a woman to cut her hair or to wear not to buy short dresses or not to go to work would not be considered a crime or even a problem unless you assume that women, by virtue of being human, have the same rights to work, have the same rights to dignity as everyone else. Do you see what I'm saying? That the reason coercive control has been invisible, and why the conference is called Invisible Violence, is because unless you give women the same entitlements to the rights that all of us take for granted, that men have taken for granted, that are human rights, unless you give them that entitlement to start, it's very hard to appreciate the harms that are done when they're denied those rights. And we'll go on with that, but let me just tell you that when I was in court with Dila, I described why she had told the police all of this about the menus. And I told the judge that her husband had made her keep a log book. And every day, every night when he came home from work, he would call her down, and she was supposed to include in that logbook, as she recounted to the police, all the menus, all the things she did during the day, any money she had spent, everything that was relevant. And he would question her every night about the logbook, and if she made any mistake, and even if she didn't, as you saw, did you think about shades? No, okay, now he beats her. Any mistake that he saw, he would then beat her for. And I presented that logbook to the court to explain how someone who is a powerful woman like Dila could be brought so low. And the prosecutor asked me, he said, "Doctor, what if I told you that I have my wife fill out on the computer every week all of the expenses, everything she's done during the week, and at the end of the week I go over all of those things with her, doctor? Would you call me an abuser?" And now, this prosecutor was not an abuser, but what he did not understand was the basic right to dignity that we defend and that Dila was defending. And 2 hours after I presented the logbook, Dila walked out of that courtroom a free woman. Because the court understood what she had been defending. That what she had been defending was not her physical life, but what she had been defending was the basic rights and liberties to which she was entitled as a human being. And killing the sleeping husband was much the same as if she had been held hostage, and no one would expect her to wait till her kidnapper awoke from his sleep before she took advantage of his sleeping to escape. Do you see what I'm saying? So coercive control is really what we're here to talk about. And I'm going to have to go very, very briefly over these, but I've already told you that the violence in coercive control is repeated, but importantly, it may not exist. In 25% of the cases where we see all of the examples of battering, there has been no physical abuse. And I just want you to understand that as you think about why it's so important to have a law that defines a pattern of conduct that denies people rights and liberties as the crime of abuse, not just physical violence. If we look at male versus female violence, is that what this is? I think so, yes. What you see is that the frequency of men's violence is much greater than the frequency of women's. I won't go through this. Women in the UK and this table shows that, are telling us that these things are happening frequently or all the time. I want quickly just to also show you that in addition to chronic physical violence, a regular element of coercive control is sexual coercion. Not just rape, but sexual coercion, meaning making women do things sexually that they don't want to do. And the continuum of sexual coercion extends in these families from literal rape, which we see in 34% of the cases of domestic violence, to rape as routine. When Dealer first got married, it was an arranged marriage. Soon after they were married, she laughed on the phone with his uncle and he beat her. And then he wanted to have sex with her. And she did not want to have sex because she had just been beaten. So he tied her hands behind her back with a belt and he had his way with her. And she told me, I never said no to him again. In other words, from then on, sex for her was carried out with the fear and memory of that first time when she had been constrained. Professor Logan is going to talk about stalking and other forms of intimidation. I just want to emphasize that much of the intimidation that we see in coercive control looks like love. One of my clients is a softball pitcher. I don't know if you know the game of softball with a big baseball. Anyway, her boyfriend comes to all of her games, and when she's very successful, he begins to get a feeling that he is being neglected because she's getting all of the attention. Do you see? And so he comes onto the field and he says, darling, you're cold. Here is your sweatshirt. And all of her other team members think he's such a loving partner, and only she understands that he is sending a message that if she doesn't cover up that night, she will be beaten. Do you see? So much of what goes on, and particularly in teenage relationships, is characterized by events that look like love. Again, we don't have time to go into detail, and we will in the next few days, but I do want to just make clear that the essence of coercive control is the literal process of being controlled, of having your money taken away from you. Dr. Postmus is going to talk about economic abuse. 54% of the men that we are arresting in the United States are themselves telling us that they have taken their partner's money. The next time you think about a woman being psychologically dependent, ask yourself how she is expected to escape and leave if she has no money. Exploiting women by taking the money that they have, but also preventing them from getting access to food and money and car and all of the necessities of life. Again, commonplace. And if police and social workers don't ask about it, we don't see it. Just to give you some statistics quickly, you can look at those in your book. You'll see that I'm not making this up, that in 85% of the cases in the UK and 66% of the cases in the US, men are monitoring their partner's time, much in the way that Dealer's time was being monitored. So let me just skip and very quickly lay on where I think we are. First, to emphasize the theme of the conference, there is nothing like there's nothing like coercive control in men's experience. Nothing. And I think it's really important because we have to make clear when we're explaining coercive control that it is linked to sexual inequality. I didn't mention, but should now emphasize, that the focus of control, even though it includes taking money, it includes not letting her drive, it includes denying her access to her family through isolation, the essence of coercive control is the micromanagement, the way Dealer Barisha's life was micromanaged, of how they enact the gender roles that women take on simply because they're women. How they dress, how they clean, how they cook, how they have sex, how they socialize, how they parent. In other words, the heart of coercive control, and the thing that makes it a gender crime and distinguishes it from any form of abuse that men experience, is the use of women's roles as the focal point for control. Getting the woman to behave and enact so that she is exactly the kind of woman that he wants. And there are no words to describe coercive control in our vocabulary, which is why we need to give it a name and why we need a specific law. And many of the liberties, women's right to dress themselves, women's right to toilet themselves, women's rights to choose their own food or to call their families, many of these rights are so taken for granted in our society that when they're violated, we don't notice it. We think maybe it's a bad marriage, a bad relationship, but we don't see it. And let me end with these points. First, woman abuse and coercive control is not about what men do to women. That's not what it's about. No matter how much men hurt women, no matter how much men control women, this is not why we're excited to go into this field and work on behalf of women who are experiencing this. It is not what men do to women that we need to focus on. What we need to focus on is what men prevent women from doing for themselves. It's because women cannot become fully themselves, cannot contribute to our community fully economically, cannot fully give themselves to their children, cannot fully give themselves as wives and lovers and mothers and sisters, and mostly cannot actualize and become themselves the way every adult has an entitlement to be, that coercive control is so harmful. And it's why we talk about it not as an assault crime, but as a liberty crime. And why what we're finding is what puts women at risk is not the physical violence, but is depriving them of the capacities to survive and escape physical violence when they are abused by taking their money, by controlling their lives. And so study after study is showing that what puts women at risk for being killed, what puts women at risk for being seriously injured, is not the physical violence, but the level to which they have been deprived of autonomy and of dignity and of freedom of speech and of the basic movements that we associate. So I'm going to stop there, except to make one underlying point that I've made before and address this. Women who experience coercive control suffer differently than women who experience any other form of abuse. And that's because, and again, I don't want you to think me or the other speakers are wild feminists who've come from another planet, although the U.S. is another planet. Women who experience these things experience them differently, not because they're weak, but because these experiences occur in the context of persistent inequalities. This is why I said at the beginning, you can't address partner abuse simply at the level of the offender and the victim, unless you simultaneously address at the level of the community the inequalities that remain in between the sexes. You can have a batterer program, but it will only be successful if the norms in the community support full equality. You can release a woman, you can protect a woman by putting her in shelter, but if she goes back and there's no job for her, and the community is still one in which inequalities are allowed to persist, she is going to be abused again. Because coercive control occurs in the context of inequality, this is where the policy, legal, and service response has to begin. And so in the next few days, we're all going to be addressing in one way or another how the protection agenda is not only a freedom agenda, but also an equality agenda. And unless those agendas are linked, it's going to be very difficult to prevent the abuse of women and children in our midst. She wants me to say one more thing, but I was trying to respect the end. So I'm asked to just say, you took it away from me, but I'm going to say just how we're going to address this in terms of challenges. First of all, I think that there is no question that we need, like we did in England, to add coercive control to the definition of domestic violence. And we need broad policies that do that. And so we have to add coercive control to the definition of partner abuse. I won't go into the issues of self-defense because they're far ahead of us. But it certainly is true that when women are violent in the context of coercive control, we need to recognize that the defense of freedom and liberty is a right that all of us have. And ask yourself, if someone took a man and forced him, as Dealer was forced, to eat off the floor, or to dress a certain way, or not to leave the house, and he responded by killing the person who was doing that, or reacted violently, whether we would judge him as negatively and force him to produce psychological evidence that he was a bad person. It also means that if we're going to address men's violence, we can't just address men's violence against women. We also have to address men's violence against men. And we have to recognize that a norm of our programs is not simply stopping violence, but creating peace. And peace in a community does not mean simply the absence of violence. If someone is not equal, if someone is not free, the absence of violence is not a gift. Do you understand? So we have to make sure that in ending violence, we're also creating an atmosphere where people can experience dignity and equality to the fullest. We have to learn, and again, I made this point, to distinguish in our work domestic violence in the strong sense. That is domestic violence that's intertwined and inseparable from inequality and takes the form of coercive control. We also have to teach our social workers and our police to distinguish and make that distinction in our policy between fighting, where men and women may be equal, partner assault, which may be an important issue that we have to address, but can be addressed pretty much under current law, and coercive control, most of which is now invisible and has to be brought into the open. And again, what that means is in all of our work, we have said from the beginning, the most important issue is safety. We have to prioritize safety. But let me tell you something. I have worked now almost 50 years with women who are abused. Every single woman I have worked with has understood that when she does something that reflects what she wants to be, something that comes out of her being, that says, this is who I am, this is what I want, she is putting her safety at risk in an abusive relationship because she wants freedom. Every woman I have ever worked with who has been abused is a feminist. Now, I don't mean she's a feminist with a capital F. One of my clients is a motorcycle, he runs a motorcycle shop, George, very big, and he dresses in black. And all the other men who are batterers and rapists are very afraid of George. And he's married to a very small woman who's and believes that she has been put on earth to serve men. But every once in a while, I won't use vulgarity, but every once in a while, she has the 3 children and she asks George to take a dish from the table to the sink. And he screams, "Feminist!" And he becomes abusive. So when I say feminist, I just mean that women want something for themselves. It may be very small. But in the eyes of men, that challenge is just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg to full equality and dignity, and they feel that if they give that, they have to give it all. You see what I mean when I say a feminist? So we need to learn to distinguish between fights and partner assaults and the underlying pattern of coercive control. And we can't do that if we just look at the incident. Because an incident of fights, an incident of assaults, looks exactly like an incident of coercive control. until we drop a plumb line and find out the entire history and course of conduct in that family. So that in one family we learn that this is the first assault, or that he only hits her when he's drunk and it's only happened 3 times, and there may be forms of community social work that can restore and remediate that problem. And in the next family we learn that this is a course of conduct that has been going on for years, and it's based on a systematic denial of this woman's rights, and this offender needs to be removed from that house and punished to the full extent of the law, as we send a message that this will not be tolerated in our community. That when one of us is unequal, then all of us are unequal. That one of us is denied dignity, all of us are denied dignity. And the protection must be, so we have to balance safety in our work with the emphasis on freedom, and begin to take in our own work the same risks that battered women themselves take every day of their life by speaking out about the liberty rights and the independent rights these women have. And we also need to recognize, and we've learned this by hard experience in the US, that when we change one aspect of the system response, but we don't change them all, things actually get worse for women. In other words, if we start identifying them in the hospital, but don't protect them by removing the batterer with the police, things are going to get worse. When we report them to the authority and social work comes to the house, but we don't provide real protection against the retaliation by the offender, things can get worse, and so on. So we need, and we have done in the US, develop a coordinated community response where all of the agencies involved are sitting at the table. And now we're not talking, remember, just about social work and police. We're talking about the employment, the employers. Because remember, coercive control follows women throughout the community. And Dr. Logan will talk about this, I'm sure, extensively with stalking. It crosses social space. So wherever coercive control occurs, that's where we have to be. If it's occurring in the shopping mall, we have to have our services there, at work there, at school there. And those are the people who have to be at the table in a coordinated response. And finally, I'll just say what I already emphasized. None of this will work effectively unless we link the anti-violence agenda to the equality agenda. Unless we recognize that policies to prevent abuse have to be identified with policies that fully empower women. Because, again, what makes a battered woman is her socially constructed inability to escape and survive when she's threatened with abuse. And the reason she can't survive and escape effectively is because she does not have full access, either within that home or within our community, to the full liberty rights without which she cannot be an entitled citizen. And so ultimately, the move to protect women from domestic violence is what we say in the US, a civil rights movement, as well as a human rights movement. And it is one of the most fundamental, I believe, of our time, even though we don't always see it in that way. Is that it?